My mentors really have come from books, the books I read, the podcasts I listen to.
Listening to podcasts really made a difference for me. Like,
can't suggest that enough.
Yeah, I would say I have a couple books, but the podcast that I really love is
I probably listen to podcasts for 20 hours a week, at least.
This week, we just had to ask. As a founder, what are your favorite podcasts? Oh, and don't worry, we've got you covered. We've got a list of these recommendations, plus some bonus ones linked below. Don't forget to check it out.
listening to podcasts really made a difference for me. Like listening to other founders, listening to other people that have done, and kind of like from every conversation, from every kind of like episode that I listened to, I took something out, and I think that's been an amazing resource for me.
The Starting Greatness podcast has been great. That's been like one of my favorite podcasts to listen to.
There's a podcast called Startup and also one called The Pitch. Those are both, I think, great podcasts, particularly for entrepreneurs.
So I have listened to podcasts since 2009, probably. And I probably listened to podcasts for 20 hours a week, at least. When I was at my corporate job, I would literally listen to podcasts the entire workday. And I really thought of it like I was getting paid to educate myself.
the podcast that I really love is How I Built with Guy Raz. I love listening to other entrepreneur stories, and he interviews some really great ones that have built some really great businesses. So that's a good one for me, and I would say for anyone that wants to start up their own business.
I also love How I Built This with Guy Raz. My dad, who has been unbelievably supportive and helpful throughout this entire process, is a huge fan of Guy Raz. And I am actually currently reading Guy Raz's book, also called How I Built This. I really just appreciate hearing fellow founder stories. And I think he is the one who can really cut through all of the fluff to understand at the end of the day, how did they start where they were and get to where they are today? So I really appreciate that podcast.
In terms of podcasts, obviously I like How I Built This. Very, very good podcast. Shout out to the whole crew, everybody behind the scene. They really put a lot of time and effort, and the whole production. I know it's a lot of time and they never get the shine, but it's very highly appreciated. The whole production team, I love it. Good production. How I Built This, Masters of Scale with Reid Hoffman, and especially his podcast with Peter Thiel. That is the most important podcast episode I ever listened to.
Maybe my favorite podcast it's a British podcast. It's called No Such Thing as a Fish. And it's a podcast from the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, with 4 people that talk about the most random facts in the news in the last week. And it's very interesting because the 4 people are, they have like encyclopedic knowledge of everything in the world. And so it's very humorous. So I think that is like one of the podcasts that I listen to in my evenings when I'm not working, because it's very relaxing. And sometimes you just find out a very strange, quirky fact that you can use for whatever, or that becomes a fun story the next day in the office. So, yeah.
The All In podcast is one that I've kind of been listening to.
Recently, I'm quite into the podcast of Huberman Life. Yeah.
I mean, I'm listening to marketing, I'm listening to tech, legal, Entrepreneur on Fire at the time was the big one, like Smart Passive Income, Tim Ferriss. I mean, I listen just constantly listening to podcasts because you can multitask, audiobooks, books in general.
Tim Ferriss's podcast I always enjoyed. So like the breadth of his guests is always so interesting. But I would say number one for me is definitely Starting Greatness that way. Mike Maples does that podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I love anything Bill Simmons does. He does the Ringer Network. One that I've gotten into recently of his is the Rewatchables. So they talk about movies that came out in the past and sort of recap it. It's a lot of fun to watch the movie and then hear them talk about it. So that's been a fun pandemic activity for me.
I don't have per se like a formal mentor. And maybe it's time that I do. It's something I was actually thinking about just the other day. But my mentors really have come from books, the books I read, the podcasts I listen to. I know that's maybe a cop-out answer, but it's something that I have a lot of mentors, I guess you could say.
Even though the responses we received were quite diverse, most answers emphasized the value that comes from listening to other founders' experiences. This significance holds up whether they prefer books, podcasts, conferences, videos, Twitter feeds, newsletters, or blogs. Their most actionable inspiration comes from hearing from those who live the entrepreneur reality every day. Now, that's an idea we can certainly get behind, even if we're a little biased.